I'm Regina Hopper, President and CEO of ITS America. What a powerful room, right? We have private companies joining public agencies, academia, and research. That's ITS America's membership. ITS America 2016 San Jose, now that was put together to explore every aspect of this extraordinary moment in transportation. ITS is real. Technology plus transportation, it equals transformation. ITS America 2016 San Jose was also put together to showcase and advance intelligent transportation for the future. A future that will be defined by integrated mobility, the smart, sophisticated interplay of man and machine, of car and of driver, computers and connectivity, pedestrians and public transit, and infrastructure, both physical and in the digital world. ITS, well, it's personal. ITS is about making our transportation safer. And it's about transportation that's at the center of the Internet of Things, or, as we call today's theme, wheels and things. We live in a world where one-third of all new wireless subscriptions so far this year are for cars, where innovation is allowing us to move people and our economy in a faster, safer, more sustainable way, revolutionizing what the future might hold for our economy, for our environment, and for our own quality of life. And it is our working together, working through technology issues, working through public policy issues, that is perpetually clearing a path to accelerate what's around the next corner as we move ahead. So far this morning, we have heard from public leaders at all levels of our government. Now we turn to the private sector with a real innovator and a real visionary. For a show that's celebrating and spotlighting a brand new world, I can't imagine beginning this day in any better way than with one of the leading lights among ITS CEOs, one of the few female ITS CEOs. This is a woman who won awards for her marketing of autonomous vehicles when she worked at Google. A woman who went to Wharton and went to MIT. A woman who is bringing transportation into the next century. And I am personally honored and thrilled to welcome to the stage Seval Oz, CEO, Continental ITS.
And thank you all in ITS for hosting this. I like the name so much, I named a company after it, Continental Intelligent Transportation Systems. So let's get started. Have you ever fired your car? Think about that, right? In a generation, our kids will be asking us why we even bothered to drive. If you think about how cars are built, and if you think about how cars are programmed, they're actually being trained more and more to think the way we would think. So I think it'll feel strange in 3 to 5 years to not have a car who can figure things out through autopilot, and you'll feel as if the car isn't doing its job if it's not taking you on time where you need to go. What if all communication was free and we could harvest energy from TVs or radios or cell towers? Well, that technology is upon us now. I see this with startups and with small area-type companies that are developing this technology. It's not too distant in the future that we won't have to recharge our cell phones anymore. They'll just be charged. The future is the new present. These are renderings of events in the parking lot around our office. So now you launch an app and gas comes to your car. Most cars these days don't have locked gas tanks. So that's doable, right? EV charging. If you think about most of you are city planners, city developers, traffic managers, and you think about things like how are you going to get locations for recharging batteries? Well, together with battery chemistry changing, now you're having also the concept of tethered EV chargers coming to the vehicles. So maybe that concept of having to invest in large infrastructure stations or converting gas stations into EV platforms may not need to be necessary anymore. Companies like Zipcar that are reinventing themselves as on-demand furniture delivery because of the need. And then Drew, the Domino pizza bot that now can deliver right to your doorstep on demand, launching an app. Not even an app, it's an emoticon. So you all know most about what is enabling the change. It's a convergence of technology, the cloud infrastructure, behavior, human lifestyles, and new business models, thank God, which can support this creative, clever type of new approach. We have Moore's Law, we have cloud computing, and we have what I like to think more of machine thinking rather than machine learning. Because really what we're thinking about is how does the machine know what we want to do? So that predictability element is now going to start to come into our software development paths. So we need a little bit of help, right? I mean, we're sort of in a situation here where the temperature around the world is warming. And if we look at the history, I've traced actually the history back to 1880. We saw the first blip with the atomic bomb release in the 40s. And now, unfortunately, we have what looks to be an unreversible scenario. Well, I believe that we can look at the glass half full in this case and think about, can we reverse it and what do we need to do to reverse this? If you take the slope of the regression of that 2% increase, it's basically in 63 years from now, we have rising sea levels that could make Route 101 underwater. I'm not going to say that's going to happen. I'm just saying that if we don't deal with these problems, and emissions is a very obviously important one emitted from vehicles and mobile platforms, is that we are going to have a situation where we won't be able to go from one point to another without having to have a tunnel type scenario. So one of the things I like to think about is collectively, collegiately, collaboratively, what can we do as a society? And one of the things that I'm really grateful to see in my lifetime is this whole shared economic approach to how we're doing things. So it's becoming more about the we generation. And let's take a little thought about that for a second. Oh, volume's lost. Basically, he's saying, mine, 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 and stumping out his partner. Sorry about that. But if we change the way we think about the ownership and the introduction of technology, we can make huge differences in the world, right? This isn't the first time we've seen this scenario. We saw it, for example, in 1963 with the measles epidemic and the collective need for the national government to fuel the vaccination required to eradicate measles. And in 20 years, by the 1980 time period, measles was all but gone. There was a sort of flipping in around the 1989s, but then that was also eradicated with variations of that epidemic, of the vaccine. So it can be done, and vaccines is one good example of how we, as a collectively, as a nation and a citizenry, can attack a problem and really eradicate it. And why not an approach like this, similar to what we have with global warming? The other thankful thing is that sharing pays. It's actually profitable and useful to have a shared platform. You can look at two small companies in our nearby surroundings, one Uber, the other Airbnb, where the business asset valuation of these companies is almost 300 times what their physical assets are. And if you look at, for example, in the hospitality area, Airbnb versus the Hyatts and the Hiltons of the world, you can see that ownership, owning assets, physical assets like buildings and plants, maybe don't make much sense in the future. So let's rethink the way we create these platforms and acquire assets. And maybe it's really about the access to these assets rather than the physical ownership of them. That requires a complete change of not only mind shift, but behavior. And luckily, we have generations of new adults coming into being that are starting to think like this, because this becomes their model for the future. Now, if you think about how this leads to a disruption of a classic mobility scenario, this is an interesting diagram which is contributed by a friend of mine, Scott Corwin at Deloitte. And if you see on the horizontal axis, you see vehicle ownership. And on the vertical axis, you see the control. And nirvana being the fourth quadrant up there, which is what I call the new age of accessible autonomy. And so if you think about how companies need to migrate from quadrant 1 to quadrant 2, to a third quadrant, which is the beginning of driverless revolution, and then ultimately the access where you have shared ownership and vehicle autonomy. You get to a scenario where the cost structure quite substantially changes. Right now, we're about $1 a cost per vehicle mile. If you move into a world of car sharing, you reduce about 30% of the cost. Now go into quadrant 3, where you're starting to autopilot, so the car is driving most of the way from manual to autonomy. You're up at almost half the cost of a vehicle mile. And then you take the driver out of the equation, and you're at 1/3 of a cost of what it takes to drive a vehicle mile. This is huge, ladies and gentlemen. This in itself is driving the paradigm shift that we're talking about today. So if you think about some of the friends I know in these businesses, how they're attacking the problem, you can see they have different approaches, right? Uber is going for the car shared model and probably going to end up somewhere in quadrant 4 through autopilot and running around with sensors on most vehicles. You see Tesla has a different approach. Right now, Tesla is driving roughly 1 million miles every 10 hours. That's 1 million miles a day, right? I think about the amount of miles that it took Google to get, the amount of time it took Google X to get to 1 million miles. We're dealing with a huge, now all of a sudden, different scenario about how we take data in and the size of this data that we're able to manage. And then you have the Google approach, which basically wants to take the driver out of the equation and go right to level 5. Right? So these are 3 different approaches to how we want to access full autonomy, and it's not going to happen overnight, so why not? Let's try different approaches. I'm all for this. So digitalization, that's the new buzzword, I think, in the 20th century, or 21st century as we're moving in. And it's really about taking physical assets that we've had locked up, stored away in vaults underneath bridges and tunnels and whatnot, and now all of a sudden pushing them into the cloud where people can access them and actually make intelligent systems and software out of them. So here is an example of the city of New York City, where they have now the hubs where you're able to connect up, you're able to pair right away, and you have information about bus routes and public transportation routes. How many of you today drove your own car to work, or to this event, sorry? Okay, not too much. How many of you took public transportation? All right, and then how many of you took a form of a shared ride, Uber, taxi, whatever? Well, you know, on its own, you can see the difference here, right? Ladies and gentlemen, you all are gravitating to the fact that when you have a vehicle that can come within 3 minutes of picking you up, it's a no-brainer to think about taking that vehicle, especially if it's cheaper than the total cost of the ownership of the vehicle, plus parking, plus insurance, et cetera. So cities have the ability to become the new network platform, to become and create the hub of the network effect. And you saw in the 2 or 3 previous slides how the extreme business model of that in its own can really revolutionize how cities can now develop new services and new opportunities to manage growth and to create wonderful places where people want to go. Why do people live in cities to begin with? Intimacy, scalability, access to things like culture. I mean, it's basically bringing the whole concept of what we're trying to do with mobility into a central hub formation. On-demand goods and services delivery, lightning fast communications, these are all enablers that are going to really change the way in which we now build our cities and develop our ecosystem for communication. So if you look at the infrastructure and map of transportation in a city, at peak traffic on a U.S. highway, on any given U.S. highway, we only use roughly 8% of the vehicle roads, of the surface road space. Well, I submit to you, if that's the case, why are we even considering building more roads if we don't use the roads we have currently to their maximum capability? And we all know this can be done better, right? We all knew with platooning, with intelligent traffic light systems, we can make this 8% probably graduate to about 58% within a matter of time. We talked a little bit about how Uber is mapping and how Tesla's mapping. This is a map that Uber created within a month of having Uber journeys and lifts basically be planned out. So you can see that one of the critical needs for self-driving is highly precise mapping. And the scalability of high precise mapping is done when you build it from the ground up, when the vehicle is able to process this intelligence on the ECU and have this information then stored in the cloud with mission-critical, non-latent information dropped down. Then you enrich it with weather, you enrich it with different traffic information, you enrich it with all the surrounding data, and you have a dynamic map tile updating map on its own. And many of us now drive with our Androids or our iPhones in our hands. Well, this will now be the car who has access and knowledge over this information. So if you look at the environmental model of the current vehicle on the road, it sees only about out to 300 meters. Well, is this really enough, right? Think about the days in which we cannot see beyond that. So what's happening now? Companies like ours, like Continental, are creating these systems, enabling sensors to talk freely with one another through vehicle to vehicle and V2X, but also even before that comes along, we're able to now send information to the vehicles behind us to let them know there's a curb up front that's actually quite icy because there's a dry ice patch, or there is an accident in the road. So the extension of the horizon, what we call e-horizon, is very much part of now the new systems we're developing for cars so that they have much greater field of view, they have much greater distance recognition, and we have now a much smarter vehicle. So getting back to the cities, I look at cities as living organisms and using data to smartly digitalize all these different services. So now when you buy a home, right, you can have your electric bill, your heating bill, maybe your phone bill, your Comcast or cable bill, and your mobility bill, right? You can pay a monthly mobility bill. Think about the fact that the cost of that versus the cost of the building to now build parking. Think of the cost, the human cost and the tax cost, the society cost of having to build parking lots instead of parks. And think about one versus the other in terms of the services the city can now provide. And some of these cities actually are doing it right now and are quite advanced. This is an example of Barcelona, for example. Well, they've built an operating system for the city's own OS, where basically you're taking external data, you're taking open source data, and you're able now to bring this together to give directions. Now the data and the people are starting to control what happens at traffic congestions. So it's a really exciting time also to think about the way we're using data. And here's an example, and there's a gentleman here, I think from the New York City Port Authority, where the dot traffic management center right now in New York City is equivalent to the JFK satellite systems control. But this is not possible to humanly manage all this data going forward, so we have to continue to think about how maybe robots and other traffic control systems, how drones can manage some of this data in the sky or wherever in terms of the physical terrain of the environment. So V2X, which is coming around, will enable a lot of this safety, and we're looking at, for example, intersection collision warnings, where the car acts like a transmitter and receiver of data back to the traffic signal and saying, it's time, there's no traffic, I should be able to go right now, and basically dictate the rules of the road. Real-time traffic flow regulation is another area where we think we can support software in a way that enables us to think about traffic management better. Increased accessibility for pedestrians and bicyclists, right? The ability for the car to know that there is a vector bicycle coming on the right and there's a pedestrian crossing an intersection. What do? The car can now help manage that scenario, at least communicate with those other two forms of transportation. And then warnings based on driver profiles, right? I mean, if the gentleman on your left at the intersection tends to be heavy on the throttle, maybe the car knows that, and maybe the car needs to take a more conservative approach to managing that intersection. So in terms of what services can your city offer, I mean, across the board, I think the cities are acting much more aggressively about these opportunities. I mean, as Regina said, we saw 78 cities now apply for the government grant, and the fact that 78 cities applied tells us that they're willing and able to prepare for the next generation of mobility services. So this is a good thing. So think about how we can support this effort now, the same way we supported the vaccination effort and global warming efforts, et cetera, as a society, and build on this and enable us to create more and more cities. And think about if you're offering these in your own environments. So one of the great things about working in Silicon Valley is you occasionally get to release some interesting product through stitching together some cool new software. And that's one of the things that I want to show you here. When you think about these new services, don't think as a linear curve. Think in terms of the needs out there for on-demand services. And here's a product that we created in our office in Silicon Valley, and I wanted to share it with you. It's not in the public market yet, but we're hoping it will get there soon. So can we roll the tape? I often tell my teams that technology is made for humans, not for machines. So let's think about the way we live our lives and then things and the ways in which we can improve our environment. And this is my 12-year-old daughter, and she's the most important asset that I have. But I have to tell you something, the most important asset that all of you should have is your time. And as a society, we really don't value our time. At least when we did studies back in my previous company, we found that people didn't value the time of enhanced productivity. But we should. And we should think about the wastefulness of duplicating efforts. And one of the great reasons why I think we should come together over the next few days here with ITS America is to really think about how we don't need to duplicate and we don't need to invest in obsolete infrastructure. We can create the environment that we want. So welcome you and enjoy the next couple of days and have fun.